Right in the center of the chaos of the Team Fortress timeline, there was the Gravel War, an iconic yet unnecessary conflict between two brothers that began as a petty squabble. This clash between Red and Blue was felt across the whole of the Badlands. The most interesting part was that the brothers had no idea that they were just pawns in a much larger plan. Within a secret location, there was one person who watched from a distance, plotted and had anyone killed that got in her way. A chain-smoking seductress that would do almost anything to win. Who was this master manipulator? How did she rise to power? And what was her ultimate goal? In this video, we explore a woman who is considered by many to Team Fortress what the G-Man is to Half-Life, the elusive and cunning administrator. Our story begins way back in the 1800s. Zephaniah Mann was a well-known adventurer, philanthropist, and entrepreneur. In his younger years, he had generated a vast wealth in which, by 1822, he had procured Mann Manor in Man-upon-Thames in the United Kingdom. The bulk of his wealth had come from his munitions company, Mann & Sons Munitions Concern, the perfect company for a world with constant wars. With his aide, Barnabas Hale, Mann offered to supply the weaponry and ammunition they required for their wars. Business was good. On top of this, Zephaniah was blessed with the birth of 3 children, Blutarch, Redmond, and Grey. However, Grey was different and he was stolen by an eagle. As a man always in search of adventure and discoveries, Zephaniah travelled with Barnabas to his aide's homeland, the Terra Australis. It was here that he discovered something fascinating. A rare metal with extraordinary properties, a metal he called Miracle Gravel. Having found something incredible, Mann sought out and procured as much of the Miracle Gravel as he could and stored it in secret caches. Blutarch and Redmond grew up surrounded by wealth, and they truly did not appreciate what they had. Zephaniah had worked hard to supply a great life for them, but all they did was argue with each other. By 1850, in a rare moment, the brothers appeared to agree on something. A continent-sized piece of land in the unclaimed frontier of the Americas. They claimed that this land was full of gravel for as far as the eyes could see. Gravel that would allow the family business to expand into the uncolonized westernmost regions. With trust in his sons, Zephaniah Mann spent the entirety of his fortune and sold the family estate. Upon his arrival in the Americas, Zephaniah discovered not a land full of gravel, but a windswept desert hell of just sand. While he was disappointed, Zephaniah attempted to set up a new home on his new land. By his side, his maidservant, Elizabeth, looked after the home and watched over his adult children as Zephaniah attempted to use what was left of his fortune to keep his other businesses afloat. Throughout his time in this new world, Zephaniah had contracted several ailments. On the sailing trip over, he had contracted white plague, marasmus, sweating, and tumours of the eyelids, to name just a few. By the time he had arrived at the new estate and settled in, he had contracted at least 17 conditions: shingles, jaundice spine, falling sickness, stationary sickness, and walking sickness. Alongside his pain, Zephaniah's secret third son, Grey, resurfaced. He was much smarter than Blutarch and Redmond, and he knew about the miracle gravel that his father and Barnabas had discovered. Despite the threat of blackmail, Zephaniah ignored his son and continued to keep his existence secret. Zephaniah Mann's health deteriorated quickly, but he did have the closest to him around. Barnabas procured poppy flowers to create medicines to reduce the extreme pain Zephaniah felt. Elizabeth became his most trusted confidant and stayed by his bedside. His sons also stayed close, but continued to bicker. Zephaniah had had a remarkable life, but he was not ready to go. However, he knew his time was close. In his final days, Zephaniah's family surrounded him, and a photo was taken to remember this moment. Elizabeth at his side, his two sons either side, and his aide and friend Barnabas, who had helped him build up Man and Sons Munitions Concern, watching over him. In his final moments, Zephaniah wrote his last will and testament. He left his aide, Barnabas Hale of the Australias, complete control of Man & Sons Munitions Concern. To his sons, Blutarch and Redmond, he left the greatest curse of all, the land he had purchased in the New World, and it would be split evenly between both of them. They had wasted their lives bickering over nothing, so he would leave them this land to actually have something to argue over. Most importantly, to his dearest Elizabeth, he left everything else, the residue of his estate, his deeds, accounts, debt public and private, his tobacco plantation, and whatever remained of the fortune his sons had not squandered. He also asked that she find the gravel that had eluded him on the land and place it inside of a pit. For Elizabeth's eyes only, he also had a secret message. He explained that his weakling son, Gray, had resurfaced a year before and threatened him for this miracle gravel he and Barnabas had discovered during their trip to Australia. Zephaniah left the entirety of his cache of this substance and asked that she keep it safe and secret. Upon the death of Zephaniah Mann, his will was read out, and then everything changed. The acquisition of Miracle Gravel was life-changing for Elizabeth. With her inherited assets, Elizabeth fulfilled the wish Zephaniah had left in his will. She created the gravel pit and kept the existence of Miracle Gravel secret. She also used her new resources to discover what this metal was actually capable of. Just being around the substance increased intelligence and virility, to name just two benefits of Miracle Gravel. However, Elizabeth discovered one more. It also allowed those who used it correctly the ability to hyperextend the natural human lifespan, something Grey Man had also discovered. With the value in this metal, Elizabeth travelled to Australia to attain as much of the Miracle Gravel as she could. As predicted by Zephaniah, Blutarch and Redmond's acquisition of the land turned into a full-scale conflict. Blutarch formed a company, Builders League United, a company that, on paper, specialized in construction operations, but under the desert sand lay secret bases of operations for mercenaries that Blutarch had hired to claim Redmond's land. On the other side of this, Redmond also established a company, Reliable Excavation Demolition. On paper, it was a company that specialized in demolition operations. Just like Builders League United, it had secret military bases underground with the goal to claim Blutarch's land. In the background, under the leadership of Barnabas Hale, Man & Sons Munitions Concern supplied weaponry and ammunition for this conflict. Having both hired mercenaries with a similar structure, this war between brothers quickly turned into a stalemate. Over in Australia, the population discovered new, natural sources of the Miracle Gravel Elizabeth had begun to stockpile. Believing themselves to have been the first to discover it, the Australians called this metal Australium, and quickly they discovered just what it was capable of. As 1890 arrived, Australia outpaced the rest of the world in technology with the exploration of teleportation. cloaking, and the entire spectrum of the mustache sciences, and they would only continue to expand. The years of war had been for nothing. The only thing that had changed with the Badlands in New Mexico was that Plutarch and Redmond had grown older. Elizabeth had worked in the shadows and appeared not to have aged a day. Plutarch knew that both he and his brother would both die without a result on this land, so he reached out to Radigan Conager, a local engineer. He asked the engineer to create a life extender machine. If he could outlive his brother, he would win this petty squabble. With something new to explore, Radigan agreed and returned to his store, Conager's Tool and Munitions. However, inside, he was met by Elizabeth. This woman appeared to know everything. She knew that Plutarch had asked the engineer to develop a device that would allow him to outlive his brother. Elizabeth asked that if Radigan were to create a life extender machine for Plutarch, then he should also make one for Redmond. In return, she had an offer he could not refuse. She offered him £100 of Australium of the caches she had stockpiled over the years. She explained that if it could make a genius out of an Australian, what could it do for a man of his capabilities? With this agreement, a partnership was solidified between Radigan Conager and Elizabeth. As promised, Radigan developed his first life extender device on the 17th of July 1894 for Plutarch, and then he created his second on the 3rd of August for Redmond in the same year. In secret, he also created one more device. It has not been confirmed who this was developed for. Given Elizabeth's lack of aging and relationship with the Conager family line for the generations to come, it is very likely that this was created for her. As the years passed, Elizabeth and Radigan continued to work together, and she shared the location of some of her caches of Australium. In the background, Grey Man also worked on his own life extender device. Not a lot changed over the next 50 years. By 1920, the Gravel War simply continued as Plutarch and Redmond refused to die. The original mercenaries that had fought became too old to fight, and a new wave were brought in. Elizabeth's activities during this period are also unknown. Another 50 years later, in 1970, the stalemate continued and another group of mercenaries were brought in to replace the old ones. Over the past 100 years, Man and Son's munitions concern was renamed to Manco. The grandson of Barnabas Hale, Saxton Hale, had also taken over from his father in the running of the company. In the grand structure of the companies of this war, TF Industries controlled all. Manco, Reliable Excavation Demolitions, and Builders League United were all divisions of TF Industries. Right at the top of this large company, one woman ran everything. She went by the name Helen, or the Administrator. Anything besides her first name is unknown. Yet, interestingly enough, Elizabeth appeared to have disappeared over these 100 years. Helen the Administrator appeared to have a striking resemblance to Elizabeth. She had a white streak in her hair, a chain-smoking habit, and on her desk, she had the very photograph that had been taken of Zephaniah Mann. Given everything we know about Elizabeth, her acquisition of the life-extending Australium, and the events to come later in this timeline, it is very likely that Helen the Administrator was Elizabeth, having changed her name over this century to hide her secrets. With the power of TF Industries, Helen held immense power over many influential figures across the planet. She had even developed an interesting relationship with Saxton Hale. Hale himself was a proud Australian, and in his earlier years had become a student of Charles Darling, a well-known hunter with a life of adventure. Despite the opportunities Darling offered Hale, the young CEO of Manco instead decided to give up his training for her. While the identity of her has not been confirmed, the common interactions between Saxton and Helen would almost solidify he had fallen for the elusive administrator. Within her control room, Helen watched over the war between Red and Blue, with a vested interest to keep this war active for as long as possible. The administrator's voice echoed across the makeshift arenas of Builders League United and Reliable Excavation Demolitions as she alerted the teams of how they were getting on, and of interesting developments during these conflicts. This gravel war made TF Industries a lot of money as both Redmond and Blue Tax companies purchased the expensive, cheaply made and unsafe weapons and ammunition from Manco. This had also made Saxton the 6th richest man in America. As for Blutarch Man, he became frustrated with the life-extended device Radigan Conager had designed and created for him. It simply zapped him with electricity every time he died and brought him back. However, he noticed that every time he did die, it took longer and longer to return. Having hired the grandson of Radigan Conager in his latest group of mercenaries, Dell, Blutarch asked the young engineer to fix the lemon his grandfather had created. To complete this task, Dell Conager was given his grandfather's designs and notes. These also contained a map of the Australian caches Elizabeth had given Radigan, along with the knowledge of the existence of a third secret life extender. It was during this period that Helen would have reached out to Dell and a working relationship formed between them. A relationship that would have also had him upgrade Redmond's life extender. To keep her control over this entire situation, Helen had pitted the brothers against one another, kept them alive, established thousands of shell companies, and filled entire coal mines with the bodies of her enemies, all from her secret base in Bilious Gorge, mostly with the help of her assistant, Miss Pauling. On one occasion, the administrator was informed that Red Demoman and Blue Soldier had developed a friendship. This would not do, and she plotted a way to break it up. As far as the mercenaries knew, they had to fight. If they talked to each other, they would know that the administrator worked for both sides, and then they would realize that this gravel war was for nothing. With her ability to manipulate any situation, Helen called Saxton and asked him to commission some special weapons for her. With a need to impress the administrator, he got straight to work. To convince the two friends to fight, the Demoman was offered the Islander, the Charging Targe, and the Scottish Resistance. For the soldier, he was offered the Direct Hit, Buff Banner, the Equalizer, and gunboats. Having successfully manipulated the mercenaries back into conflict, they fought for 7 whole days as Helen watched. Now, the reason to keep this war active was pretty apparent. As long as it lasted, more money was spent through Manco and Helen became wealthier. This allowed her to track down Australium, purchase and, in most cases, simply kill for it. Her stockpile of the substance over the past 150 years was large. Helen put in a lot of work. However, she did allow herself 1 hour free once a year from her duties as the CEO of TF Industries. On one of these years, she had visited a local park and managed to split the pigeons into warring factions. Having planted seeds of doubt about the capabilities of their pigeon leaders, she then took away all of their bread and let the chaos unfold. Helen thrived on chaos, manipulation, and most importantly, the collection of every ounce of Australium she could get her hands on. These were also traits she taught to Miss Pauling. The administrator would do anything to keep her control and to acquire every ounce of Australium that she could. This often meant that her actions went way over the line of legalities. Under her control, Miss Pauling was given what appeared to be at first a phone book, when in reality, it was a weekly list of targets that Helen wanted to be taken out. Pauling was threatened with a grave of her own if she failed in this task. The communities of the Badlands hated the ongoing conflict between Red and Blue. The population of Two Fort advocated for the war to end. Regardless, Helen did not care. On one occasion, in an attempt to discover what her mercenaries thought about her, what was important to them, and in general, what they knew about the actual war, the administrator hired a director to conduct interviews with the warriors. Just over a week after the interviews had been conducted, the mercenaries were threatened. Sniper was sent a photograph of his parents, and Heavy was sent a photograph of his head collection. These came with a warning that bad things would happen if they ever discussed their very private contracts with anyone. As for the fate of the director, Helen had Miss Pauling lure him into a mine with corpse-grade quicklime so that anything he had learned during this job died with him. In one of her most deplorable acts to acquire Australium, Helen was heavily involved with the Poopy Joe cover-up. Poopy Joe was the only American monkeynaut trained to travel into space. When Helen heard word the rocket that the United States government planned to use to launch the monkey into space was powered by Australium, she set events in motion to acquire the substance. With her reach, the administrator offered to host the launch event on her land in the Badlands for the small fee of $1, an offer that the government could not turn down. During the event, the administrator had Manco replace the Australian fuel supply with gravel water from defective suitcase explosives. As a result of this egregious action, the rocket exploded upon launch, and so too did Poopy Joe. This incident was then covered up. Despite their best attempts to hide the actions that had occurred on that awful day, Saxton Hale and Helen were questioned by the United States Senate about the disappearance of Poopy Joe. When asked, Hale stated that Poopy Joe was a happy monkey, and after he had landed back on Earth after the launch safe and sound, Manco had rewarded the little American hero with an all-expenses-paid holiday to a region that started with Bar, the Bahamas or Bahrain. The monkey could have also gone back to space. Who really knew? What Hale did not know was that the government had discovered the crash site of the rocket, and in their examination, they had uncovered that their Australium was missing. Hale had shown himself to be unable to answer a question properly, so when they moved on to Helen, they were surprised and shocked at just how honest she was. In a heavily redacted statement, the administrator explained that she had been stockpiling Australium for years to prevent something, and that she had used 18 perfect idiots to help her. Even now, to us, what she required the Australium for is unknown. However, when the Senate heard her reasoning, it shocked them so much that they put an end to this inquiry, let her go, and ordered for the incineration of all documentation of her part in the hearing. It must have been something bad. The tumultuous return of Grey Man changed everything. As the smartest of the Mann brothers, Gray tricked his siblings into a secret meeting and then murdered them. And thus, the Gravel War was finally put to an end. But Gray had only one task in mind: to reclaim the family business his father had given to the Hales so that he could claim the Australium procured by Elizabeth that was locked away in Manco's vaults. Helen had kept an eye on Gray and his activities. She needed the Australium for something. She had spent the last 150 years of her life tracking down every ounce. In a first attempt to forcibly take over Manco, Gray utilized robot versions of the mercenaries, yet he fell into a similar situation that his brothers had when Saxton Hale hired the mercenaries to defend the land. Gray did not want to fall into a constant stalemate, so he used his vast intelligence to instead trick Saxton Hale out of the position of CEO of Manco. The loss of control of Manco, and thus the vaults, sent the administrator into a full panic. She fled her secret base and left a message for Miss Pauling: hide. Although Gray Mann had acquired control of Manco, over the next 6 months, the administrator, with the help of Del Conager, travelled to every cache of Australium and moved it into a new secret location. The issue the administrator had was that she required Australium to power her immortality device to remain young and active. The Conager family line had upgraded her device several times over the years. In these stressful months, she used the Mark IV. Still, it used up a lot of the Australium she had spent her life to attain as much of the 89,000 tons of the material available on the planet. She had lied, cheated, and killed for it. To track down the final known cache of Australium, the administrator reached out to Miss Pauling and ordered her to get the old team back together. In the following weeks, Pauling successfully brought together Soldier, Pyro, and Demo. In a meeting in an alley, middle of 7th and Main at noon, Pauling and Helen met for the first time in 6 months. 6 months since Gray Mann had claimed control of Manco. The administrator's appearance had felt the effects of the lack of Australium, and she really relied on Pauling to track down this last cache. It was located in New Zealand. On her way there, Helen asked that Pauling destroy a specific set of genealogy records within the Twofold Public Library. Records that revealed Helen's last name and date of birth. When Pauling had completed this task and recovered the Australium, she was asked to meet her boss at a new location. Unfortunately, the task would not go as planned. As Miss Pauling returned to the mercenaries and travelled to Twofold to destroy their records and recruit Scout and Spy, Helen returned to her secret base with Del Conager. Gray Mann was desperate to discover the location of the administrator. His immortality device also required Australium to function, and he had begun to run low. In a desperate bid, he hired the classic Team Fortress mercenaries to track down Helen. On a trip to Twofold, he was also frustrated to find that Helen's genealogy records had been destroyed shortly before. Very few people knew Helen's true history. Miss Pauling had become a close confidant to her secrets, and there was also Charles Darling. It is unknown how he learned anything about the elusive administrator, but he did know that she had stockpiled the largest supply of Australium in the world over the course of 150 years. He, just like so many others, did not know what she required this material for. Within Helen's secret location, Del upgraded the administrator's immortality device. He explained that the Mark V would run much leaner and would require only a quarter of what the Mark IV had used to keep her alive. The dilemma she faced was that when the Australium supply ran out, she would die. What only Helen and Dell knew was that she had used almost every ounce of Australium in her possession to live as long as she had. She just had to be careful with what she had left. Helen was fine with this. She told Dell that the Conager family had given her so much more time than anyone deserved. Aged and withered, Helen just needed enough time to settle an old debt. Meanwhile, within the sunken country of New Zealand, Miss Pauling learned that the Australium here had been used to paint prototype rockets that had exploded. All that remained was one more rocket coated in the substance, but even this rocket was later launched into space. Pauling had failed the administrator. In a turn of events, Pauling and the mercenaries were captured by Gray and his men. They just needed Pauling to disclose the location of the administrator. Then, in another turn, Gray was attacked by the very men he had hired and his immortality device was ripped from his body. In a very weakened state, at around 150 years old, Gray told Pauling that the world would have been so different if he had gotten his hands on the Australium first. He also claimed that whatever Helen planned to do was so much worse than anything he wanted to do. Despite his attempts to almost recruit Pauling and her mercenaries, the administrator's protege said that she knew Helen. She had killed, lied, and manipulated for her. Whatever the administrator planned to do, she would be at her side. Then Gray succumbed to his injuries, and he, just like his brothers, died. The death of Gray Man put an end to yet another long-lasting feud. In an attempt to reduce the amount of Australium she consumed, Helen had allowed herself to die, but her death was only temporary. In order to get an update on the acquisition of the last known cache of Australium on the planet, Dell reached out to Pauling and he was met with the unfortunate news that it had been sent into space. 4 hours after her death, Dell brought Helen back with an infusion of Australium. He updated her on the failure of Pauling and told her that they had only one last dose of Australium left. If they used it conservatively, she could live for 5 or even 6 more months, yet Helen claimed to have an old debt to settle. In an action that shocked Dell, the administrator used every little bit of the Australium that was left. Instantly, Helen was once again restored to a much younger form, but this was only in appearance. Dell stated that her use of the substance in this way had dramatically reduced her life expectancy. Without an additional infusion of the substance, she had gone from 6 months of life to just an hour. To Helen, that would be more than enough time to end this, once and for all. The state of the story of the Team Fortress 2 universe is in limbo. As of now, Helen has 1 hour to live, most of the classic mercenaries are dead, and Miss Pauling and her mercenaries' next step is unknown. The last Team Fortress comic came out on January 10th, 2017. 7 years ago. We were never given an ending to Half-Life, and we have never been given an ending to the Team Fortress story. At this point, we probably never will have that ending, so everybody should just come up with their own headcanon. There are still so many questions. What was this old debt that Helen spoke of? What was her real reason behind the continuation of the Gravel War? How did Gray Man know about her plan? How did Charles Darling know how old she was? Was she Elizabeth? What plan of Helen's was so bad that it scared the US Senate so much? And most importantly, did Poopy Joe suffer? The conclusion of the Half-Life series is up there as one of the most frustrating cliffhangers in video game history. I would say, however, that this story is just as excruciating. We need answers. I believe that most of my thoughts were covered pretty well in the legacy section. Having read through these comics so many times, I tend to just end up frustrated. The comics have such a great story, and we only needed that final 7th release for a conclusion. I have 2 theories about Elizabeth and who she is. The first is that she is Helen the Administrator. Everything points to that. She did not age between 1850 and 1890, and she is labelled as the same person in the Catch-Up comics. It would just make sense. My second theory is that Helen may be the daughter of Elizabeth. There is a little part at the end of the 6th comic about her craving something since she was a little girl. If she was born in around 1822, around the same time Zephaniah discovered Australia, maybe Helen's mother, Elizabeth, would have supplied her with the material and continued some sort of family legacy. It is more likely the first theory though. That was everything I wanted to cover this week, so please like the video if you liked it, share it with other Team Fortress fans, dislike it if you disliked it, and most importantly, subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Finally, I would like to thank my gold tier patrons and channel members: Jonas, Lewis, Queen Arby, Fluffy the Dragon, Chicken Guy 791, Ruben Mendoza, Duke, Toadnut, Oren X, Azu, Karatana, AJ, Verona, Comfy, BG Games, Apravis, Arnis, Blaze of Glory, Cole Sherman, Yauli Rodriguez, Nabar, and 501st Clone Boy. What was Helen's ultimate goal? Was she as bad as Grey Man? And what would you like me to cover next? Please let me know in the comments below. This is where our story ends. Check back next week for a new one.